I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, while I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones.
Wilma and Tonya, two African-American females. Wilma wears a sweatshirt filled with African-Americans in history. Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Angela Davis. They stand by a white vinyl sign on wooden poles with black and green letters, spelling, "We Rise." Behind them stands a tall monument of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A bronze-tone bust of Dr. King sits atop engraved words. The demonstration that led to the most important advance in civil rights for millions of Black Americans began here, March 21st, 1965. It was a 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The other side of the monument is black and gold stone plate. "I have a dream." Directly below, they gave their lives to overcome injustice and secure the right to vote for all Americans. Names: James J. Reed, Boston; Viola Gregg, Lizzo, Detroit; and Jimmy Lee Jackson, Marion, Alabama. Dedicated August 11th, 1979. A shorter concrete sign sits next to the monument and reads, "Brown Chapel AME Church." Behind the monuments, 8 worn gray concrete stairs lead up to a brown brick building with white archway entry doors and a white diamond place card above the archways with the numbers 1908.
Wilma Chestnut House and Tonya Michelle Jones, Alabama's Bloody Sunday, March 1st, 2021 to March 8th, 2021. Wilma and Tonya went to Alabama to recognize a significant moment in history. They were in for an eye-opening experience and lesson. The first march took place on March 7th, 1965, when Lucy Foster suggested that the people of Marion march with the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson and place his body at the feet of then-Governor George Wallace. This is only the first of what they would learn about the civil rights movement and trail and all that Bloody Sunday truly means. They traveled to Anniston, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, Marion, Africatown, and Gee's Bend. They plan to attend next year because they have more to learn. Take this journey with them and let your mind expand. All of the pictures tell a story that you will not readily forget. A special thanks to Wilbert Turner for introducing us to his beautiful family. Mr. Robert Turner Sr., Della Maynor, foot soldier at age 14 in 1965, and Miss Evelyn Turner, the last surviving member of the Marion Three.
A small old wooden shack sits in the middle of several dead trees. Weeds crawl up the front of the shack. A wooden ladder with broken, missing steps is attached by the front door from the ground to the roof. The attic door is missing. A small-scale white brick structure with the top half and front door missing. Peeking out from the inside of the structure are charred wooden planks. Wilma and Tonya on the stairs of a brown and white brick house with 1920s detailing, and a white metal awning covers a front porch with a swing. Selma, Alabama. A more landscape view of the White House. Wilma and Tonya stand on a gravel roadway. Tonya's arms are stretched slightly above shoulder level in a V, and Wilma extends her right arm in the direction of an adjacent, much smaller structure.
Freedom Riders, from Anniston to Birmingham. Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated southern United States in 1961 and subsequent years to challenge the non-enforcement of the United States Supreme Court decisions Morgan v. Virginia, 1946, and Boynton v. Virginia, 1960, which ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. The southern states had ignored the rulings, and the federal government did nothing to enforce them. The Freedom Riders were inspired by the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, led by Baynard Rustin and George Hauser, and co-sponsored by the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the then-fledgling Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Like the Freedom Rides of 1946, the Journey of Reconciliation was intended to test an earlier Supreme Court ruling that banned racial discrimination in interstate travel. Rustin, Igal Rudenko, Joe Felnett, and Andrew Johnson were arrested and sentenced to serve on a chain gang in North Carolina for violating local Jim Crow laws regarding segregated seating on public transportation. The first Freedom Ride began on May 4, 1961. Led by Corps Director James Farmer, 13 young riders, 7 black, 6 white, including but not limited to John Lewis, 21, Genevieve Hughes, 28, Mae Frances Moultrie, Joseph Perkins, Charles Person, 18, Ivor Moore, William E. Harbor, 19, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, 19, and Ed Blankenheim. They left Washington, D.C. on Greyhound from the Greyhound Terminal in Trailway buses. Their plan was to ride through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, ending in New Orleans, Louisiana, where a civil rights rally was planned. Many of the riders were sponsored by CORE and SNCC, with 75% of the riders between 18 and 30 years old. A diverse group of volunteers came from 39 states and were from different economic classes and racial backgrounds. Most were college students and received training in nonviolent tactics. The Freedom Riders' tactics for their journey were to have at least one interracial pair sitting in adjoining seats, and at least one black rider sitting up front, where seats under segregation had been reserved for white customers by local customs throughout the South. The rest of the team would sit scattered throughout the rest of the bus. One rider would abide by the South's segregation rules in order to avoid arrest and to contact CORE and arrange bail for those who were arrested. Only minor trouble was encountered in Virginia and North Carolina, but John Lewis was attacked in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Over 300 riders were arrested in Charlotte, North Carolina, Winsboro, South Carolina, and Jackson, Mississippi. The Birmingham, Alabama Police Commissioner, Bull Connor, together with Police Sergeant Tom Cook, an avid Ku Klux Klan supporter, organized violence against the Freedom Riders with local Klan chapters. The pair made plans to bring the riot to an end in Alabama. They assured Gary Thomas Rowe, an FBI informer and member of Eastview Clavern No. 13, the most violent Klan group in Alabama, that the mob would have 15 minutes to attack the Freedom Riders without any arrests being made. The plan was to allow an initial assault in Anniston, with a final assault taking place in Birmingham. Upon arriving in Anniston, Alabama, the bus from Atlanta was met by an angry mob that broke the bus windows and slashed the tires. The police stepped in, and the bus was able to continue to Birmingham, but the mob followed. When the bus driver had to stop outside of Anniston because of the damaged tires, the mob set the bus on fire and attempted to trap the passengers inside. Either an exploding fuel tank or an undercover state investigator who was brandishing a revolver caused the mob to retreat, and the riders escaped the bus. The mob beat the riders after they got out. Warning shots, which were fired into the air by highway patrolmen, were the only thing that prevented the riders from being lynched. The roadside site in Anniston and the downtown Greyhound station were preserved as part of the Freedom Riders National Monument in 2017. Some injured riders were taken to Anniston Memorial Hospital. That night, the hospitalized Freedom Riders, most of whom had been refused care, were removed from the hospital at 2 a.m. because the staff feared the mob outside the hospital. The local civil rights leader, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, organized several cars of black citizens to rescue the injured Freedom Riders in defiance of the white supremacists. The black people were under the leadership of Colonel Stone Johnson and were openly armed as they arrived at the hospital, protecting the Freedom Riders from the mob. When the Trailways bus reached Anniston and pulled into the terminal an hour after the Greyhound bus was burned, it was boarded by 8 Klansmen. They beat the Freedom Riders and left them semi-conscious in the back of the bus. A picture of the attack was reclaimed by the FBI from a local white journalist who was beaten and whose camera was smashed. Ku Klux Klan members continued to harass the Freedom Riders along their journey. When the bus arrived in Birmingham, it was attacked by a mob of KKK members, aided and abetted by police under the orders of Commissioner Bull Connor. As the riders exited the bus, they were beaten by the mob with baseball bats, iron pipes, and bicycle chains. Among the attacking Klansmen was Gary Thomas Rowe, an FBI informant. White Freedom Riders were singled out for especially frenzied beatings. James Peck required more than 50 stitches to the wounds in his head. Peck was taken to Caraway Methodist Medical Center, which refused to treat him. He was later treated at Jefferson Hillman Hospital. When reports of the bus burning and beatings reached U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, he urged restraint on the part of Freedom Riders and sent an assistant, John Steigenthaler, to Alabama to try to calm the situation. Despite the violence suffered and the threat of more to come, the Freedom Riders intended to continue their journey. Kennedy had arranged an escort for the riders in order to get them to Montgomery, Alabama, safely. However, radio reports told of a mob awaiting the riders at the bus terminal, as well as on the route to Montgomery. The Greyhound clerks told the riders that their drivers were refusing to drive any Freedom Riders anywhere. Recognizing that their efforts had already called national attention to the civil rights cause and wanted to get to the rally in New Orleans, the riders decided to abandon the rest of the bus ride and fly directly to New Orleans from Birmingham. When they first boarded the plane, all passengers had to exit because of a bomb threat. Upon arriving in New Orleans, local tensions prevented normal accommodations, after which Norman C. Francis, president of Xavier University of Louisiana, decided to house them on campus in secret. Diane Nash, a Nashville College student who was a leader of the Nashville Student Movement and SNCC, believed that if Southern violence were allowed to halt the Freedom Rides, the movement would be set back years. She pushed to find replacements to resume the rides. On May 17th, a new set of riders, 10 students from Nashville, who were active in the Nashville Student Movement, took a bus to Birmingham, where they were arrested by Bull Connor and jailed. The students kept their spirits up in jail by singing freedom songs. Out of frustration, Connor drove them back up to Tennessee line, dropped them off saying, "I just couldn't stand their singing." They immediately returned to Birmingham and Jackson, Mississippi. These clashes brought national attention to the South's refusal to follow the Supreme Court's decision, and the Freedom Riders became emblems of courage and determination. Freedom Rides Museum. The Freedom Rides Museum is located at the former Montgomery Greyhound Station, where history was made as the Freedom Riders got off their bus on May 20th, 1961. The station had been restored to appear as it was in 1961 and houses a modest collection of exhibits about the movement that eventually succeeded in ending segregation on public transportation. Exhibits include photographs, documents, and biographies of each of the brave young men and women who were part of the momentous statement. The museum is an official stop on the U.S. Civil Rights Trail.
Coretta Scott King Memorial. Mount Tabor AME Church. A taupe-colored building with a stairway gives way to 2 white doors. Next to the stairs, a 4-foot iron fence surrounds a chest-up sculpture of Coretta Scott King, 1927 to 2006. Words: humanitarian founder of the King Center and architect of Dr. King's institutional legacy. A funeral wreath with red flowers traced by white flowers shaped like a cross adorned with green leaves, and a picture of King, her name, in small writing. Wilma and Tonya stand on opposing sides of the memorial smiling. Tonya leans over the railing with her hands and gazes at the funeral wreath. Wilma and Tonya pose at the bottom of the stairs of Mount Tabor. A headstone in the cemetery with roses scrolled in the upper right and left corners. The Scott on a center scroll with the words, "They loved, they served, they kept the faith." Two names at the bottom. Bernice M., February 11, 1905 to February 26, 1996, and Obi, August 24th, 1899 to November 22nd, 1998. A wide-angle view of other headstones of varying shapes and sizes, such as hearts.
Coretta Scott King was born in Marion, Alabama on April 27, 1927. Marion is about 30 miles north of Selma. She attended Lincoln High School, where she became a leading soprano for the senior choir. She also played the trumpet and piano. She graduated from Lincoln in 1945 as valedictorian. Her parents, Obadiah Scott, from 1899 to 1998, and Bernice McMurray, 1904 to 1996, had several businesses in Perry County. They were farmers and owned land in the area since the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. She helped work the farm, including pick cotton. Her father was the first black man in the area to own a vehicle, which he used to haul lumber from his mill and carry his children to school. His lumber mill was burned down by jealous, angry white people. Coretta Scott was an American author, activist, civil rights leader, and the wife of Martin Luther King Jr. As an advocate for African American equality, she was a leader for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. King was also a singer who often incorporated music into her civil rights work. King met her husband while attending graduate school in Boston. They both became increasingly active in the American civil rights movement. King played a prominent role in the years after her husband's assassination in 1968, when she took on the leadership of the struggle for racial equality herself and became active in the women's movement. She also sought to make his birthday a national holiday. Coretta Scott King established the King Center in 1968, and it is the official memorial dedicated to the advancement of the legacy and ideas of Martin Luther King Jr., leader of a nonviolent movement for justice, equality, and peace. 2 days after her husband's funeral, King began planning $15 million for funding for the memorial. She finally succeeded when Ronald Reagan signed legislation which established Martin Luther King Jr. Day on November 2, 1983. In 1984, she came under criticism by Hosea Williams, one of her husband's earliest followers, for having sued the King Center to promote authentic material on her husband's dreams and ideals and disqualified the merchandise as an attempt to exploit her husband. She sanctioned the kit, which allowed a wall poster, 5 photographs of King and his family, a cassette of the I Have a Dream speech, a booklet of tips on how to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and 5 postcards with quotations from King himself. She believed it to be the authentic way to celebrate the holiday, honoring her husband, and denied Hosea's claims. King sued her husband's alma mater of Boston University over who would keep over 83,000 documents in December 1987 and said the documents belonged with the King archives. However, her husband was held to his word by the university. He had stated after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 that his papers would be kept at the college. Coretta's lawyers argued that the statement was not binding and mentioned that King had not left a will at the time of his death. King testified that President of Boston University, John R. Silber, in a 1985 meeting demanded that she send the university all of her husband's documents instead of the other way around. Coretta Scott King released a statement. Dr. King wanted the South to be a repository of the bulk of his papers. Now that the King Center Library and Archives are complete and have one of the finest civil rights collections in all the world, it is time for the papers to be returned home. On May 6, 1993, a court rejected her claims to the papers after finding that a July 16, 1964 letter her husband wrote to the Institute had constituted a binding charitable pledge to the university and outright stating that Martin Luther King retained ownership of his papers until giving them to the university as gifts. She, however, said her husband had changed his mind about allowing Boston University to keep the papers. In 2005, King gifted the use of her name to her alma mater, Antioch College in Yellow Springs, to create the Coretta Scott King Center as an experiential learning resource to address issues of race, class, gender, diversity, and social justice for the campus and the surrounding community. The center opened in 2007 on the Antioch campus. The center lists its mission as the Coretta Scott King Center facilitates learning, dialogue, and action to advance social justice, and its vision to transform lives, the nation, and the world by cultivating changing agents, collaborating with communities, and fostering networks to advance human rights and social justice. King became friends with many politicians before and after Martin Luther King's death, including John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Robert F. Kennedy. Her telephone conversation with John F. Kennedy during the 1960 presidential election has been credited by historians for mobilizing African American voters. In August 2005, King suffered a stroke which paralyzed her right side and left her unable to speak. 5 months later, she died of respiratory failure due to complications from ovarian cancer. Her funeral was attended by some 10,000 people, including 4 of 5 living U.S. presidents. She was temporarily buried on the grounds of the King Center until being laid next to her husband. She was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame, the National Women's Hall of Fame, and was the first African American to lie in state at the Georgia state capitol. King has been referred to as the First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement.
Lincoln Memorial Museum. A brown brick building with a glass doorway and a green awning with the words Lincoln Memorial Museum. Inside, a large rectangular room with dark wooden doors and a stage with curtains, an 8-foot folding table and 2 chairs. The walls have arch-shaped windows. The wall on either side of the windows have pictures. Picture 1. An oil painting signed by Bames 04 of John H. Dickerson, a black male wearing a bow tie and black pinstripe suit. Number 2. A painting of an older black man with gray hair, black horn-rimmed glasses, and a dark suit with the floral tie. A plaque under the portrait, Charles B. Francer, 1946 to 1954. Wilma and a black woman wearing burgundy leggings with matching top, hat, and mask stand in the center of the rectangular room. A view from a car window of a small white church with the steeple.
Lincoln Normal School. The Lincoln Normal School in Marion, Alabama, was an important institution in the history of African American education in the South. The school's roots go back to a Union Army soldier who remained in Marion after the end of the Civil War to teach newly freed African Americans. His efforts proved successful, and in 1867 the school was incorporated with the support of African Americans from the surrounding Perry County. 9 ex-slaves, Joey Pinch, Thomas Speed, Nicholas Dale, James Childs, Thomas Lee, John Freeman, Nathan Levert, David Harris, and Alexander H. Curtis made up the first Board of Trustees. Under their guidance, the black and white community of Marion raised $500 to buy land for the school's campus. The money to build the school's building came from the American Missionary Association, AMA. In 1868, school trustees sought the assistance of the AMA for help with day-to-day operation of the school. The AMA supplied teachers and financial support. In 1871, Alabama State Board of Education member Peyton Finley pushed for the school's expansion into normal school and university. The Lincoln Normal School, originally Lincoln School and later reorganized as State Normal School and University for the Education of Colored Teachers and Students, was a historic African American school expanded to include a normal school in Marion, Alabama. Founded less than 2 years after the end of the Civil War, it is one of the oldest HBCUs, historically black colleges and university, in the United States. The school sat on 10 acres with individual buildings for music, gym, cafeteria, dorm, and theater. It was burned by unknown people. This was to be the site for the Alabama State University, but due to the fire, it was reconsidered and built in Montgomery. Lincoln School became well known for graduating a high portion of students who went on to attain advanced degrees, a remarkable achievement for any school, but more particularly for a segregated high school in rural Alabama. The school closed in 1970 after 100 years when it was consolidated with the newly built and racially integrated Marion High School. One of the few buildings remaining on the campus site is the Phillips Memorial Auditorium, now on the National Register of Historic Places and the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage. The Lincoln High School Gymnasium was also added to the Alabama Register on February 29, 2005. Notable alumni: Coretta Scott King, civil rights activist and wife of Martin Luther King Jr., Edith Scott Bagley, educator and civil rights activist, William R. Pettiford, Birmingham minister and banker, Jean Childs, wife of civil rights activist Andrew Young, Odith Thelma Patton, mother of Bishop T.D. Jakes. Albert and Evelyn Turner Sr., the Marion Three. Albert Turner attempted to register vote in 1962, but despite his college education, could not pass the literacy test given. That incident galvanized Turner to organize local voter registration efforts and educate prospective voters about the voter registration tests. Traditionally, white voters in the Black Belt region of Alabama had to take advantage of absentee ballots to retain control of elected offices. Even with the increased registration of black voters, white absentee non-resident voters would vote in local elections at the behest of resident relatives and friends. Wilcox County Commissioner Bobby Joe Johnson joked, quote, "Do you know why the roads to white folks' cemeteries are paved in the Black Belt? It's so people won't get their feet wet if it rains on Election Day." Despite complaints of fraud, election officials failed to obtain any indictments for absentee voter fraud. When Turner went to Washington, D.C. to complain about fraud to lawyers at the Justice Department, he was told the government couldn't do anything. Y'all need to learn to use the absentee ballot process yourselves. Perry County and the other counties forming the Black Belt, initially named for its soil, are some of Alabama's poorest counties, and residents of the Black Belt typically travel out of their home counties for work, making it difficult to vote at local polls, which were only open in Perry County for 4 hours in the afternoon. In addition, many potential black voters in the Black Belt are elderly and/or illiterate due to inferior education, again limiting poll access. As a result, local civil rights organizations, including the Perry County Civic League, PCCL, began to register black voters for and assist them with absentee ballots. In the summer of 1984, U.S. Justice Department officials promulgated a new policy to investigate political participants who seek out the elderly, socially disadvantaged, or the illiterate for the purpose of subjugating their electoral will, applying in a selective manner against civil rights activities seeking to register black voters in the Black Belt. We had not been in Brantley, Alabama more than 20 minutes when a car skidded up to the cabin in a cloud of red dust. A black woman jumped out, and she was the mayor's maid, and she told us he had sent her to warn us out of town. He was calling out the mob, and we'd better stay out if we knew what was good for us. You tell the mayor that if he wants us, he can find us here, Al told her softly. He went out on the porch and sat down in an old rocking chair facing the street. Slowly, he rocked back and forth, back and forth. Cars and trucks filled with hard-eyed white men, the same ones that had chased us days before, drove at low speed past the house. They stared hard at Al and the rest of us as he rocked back and forth and back and forth. They drove by again and again and again, and Al just slowly rocked back and forth in that old rocking chair. At the time, Turner led the PCCL, and a rival group complained to the local district attorney that Turner and other PCCL officials were altering votes on absentee ballots. In the 1984 election, according to testimony from Jeff Sessions, who was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Alabama from 1981, and testified about the election at the congressional hearing in 1986 to decide whether to confirm him as U.S. District Judge. Out of 4,000 ballots total in Perry County, 729 were absentee ballots, which seemed like a disproportionately high number since more absentee ballots were cast in Perry than in Jefferson County, which had more than 45 times the number of residents as Perry County. At Sessions' suggestion, the FBI watched the Marion post office during the September 1984 primary election, where they saw the Turner, his wife Evelyn, and Spencer Hoke Jr. drop off absentee ballots. Election officials, under a court order, marked those envelopes and identified 75 altered ballots in the group of ballots dropped off by PCCL officials. FBI agents took the marked ballots and confronted many of the voters with allegations of ballot tampering. Of the 18 counties counted as part of the Black Belt, the investigation concentrated on the 5 counties which had posted the largest gains in black elected officials. In a later interview, Evelyn Turner explained the alterations were performed at the request of voters, assistance permitted by state law. Nevertheless, the prosecution moved forward, and Turner, his wife Evelyn, and Hogue, who became known as the Marion Three, were indicted on 29 counts by a Mobile-based federal grand jury on January 25, 1985, based on allegations of ballot tampering in the September 4, 1984 primary election. The maximum punishment was 115 years in prison and $40,000 in fines. Turner's brother Robert, a lawyer who was part of the defense team for the Marion Three, alleged in 2016 that Sessions had jailed the Marion Three to send a message. Quote, "You got a person like Albert Turner that's out front spearheading all these voter registration drives. Why not put him in jail and see how many people get scared?" This whole FBI investigation of absentee voting and the scheduled trials were set up to stop the political progress of black people in the Alabama Black Belt. The power structure wants to turn back the hands of time in Perry County and throughout West Alabama. I encourage black people not to let my indictment stop them or discourage them. We need to vote in even larger numbers because they are trying to take our right to vote away. The Marion Three were defended by a team of lawyers experienced in civil rights litigation, including Turner's brother, Robert J. L. Chestnut, Laney Guiner, James Leibman, Deval Patrick, and Hank Sanders. During the grand jury investigation in October 1984, more than 24 subpoena witnesses, many of them black senior citizens familiar with segregation-era intimidation techniques, were bused more than 160 miles to Mobile to be photographed, fingerprinted, provided handwriting samples, and testify before a federal grand jury. Grand jury records indicate that several of the questioned witnesses were also so intimidated that they would no longer vote in the future. The case moved to trial on June 19, 1985. The federal jury deliberated for 3 hours before handing down not guilty verdicts for all 3 defendants on all the charges on July 5, 1985, the day after Independence Day. Turner renewed his contention that the trial was instigated by freshman Senator Jeremiah Denton, who, Turner said, had had the most to gain by intimidating black voters. Sessions later claimed that his team, which consisted of 2 lawyers, was understaffed and unprepared to tackle a vigorous defense. Black voters' registration grew by tens of thousands, and I was proud of my late husband's well-earned nickname, Mr. Voter Registration. I was also proud to work alongside him to continue to build and grow our community's political voice. Until the day I die, I will believe that our arrests were because of our successful political activism and were designed to intimidate black voters and dampen black voting enthusiasm. The question of whether Jeff Sessions should be our nation's next Attorney General should not rise or fall with what happened more than 30 years ago. While my impression of Sessions was formed in 1985, the years since have only confirmed my views. Sessions has demonstrated a pattern of ignorance and insensitivity when it comes to race and voting record of outright hostility to policies supported by the civil rights community. During his rise in Alabama state politics, Sessions opposed several efforts to increase the racial diversity of federal judges in Alabama. In 1995, Sessions supported the idea of restarting chain gangs in Alabama, even promising to defend any legal challenges against the practice. Any state, especially one with Alabama's painful racial history, should not have their elected officials support measures that would put black men back in actual chains. As a senator, Jeff Sessions has voted against federal hate crime laws and supported voter suppression laws. He has also whitewashed his real history on race, exaggerating his past to paint himself as a champion of school desegregation and as a righteous prosecutor of the Ku Klux Klan. The Attorney General helps decide where to pursue instances of injustice and protect the idea of equal justice for all Americans. I'm afraid that Sessions would fall into emphasize or enforce civil rights laws. A little FYI, Albert Turner attracted national attention in 1978 as the manager of the Southwest Alabama Farmers Cooperative Association when he and his ex-moonshine distiller teamed up to cheaply produce ethanol for gasol from corn mash. He applied for a patent and was approved for $25 million until he said that he would use the money to teach people how to make the same product to earn and save money. He was then given $2 million and told to continue to do research. This patent was later given to a white man in Nebraska.
Selma Interpretive Center. Wilma and Tonya stand in front of a circular white brick building under the words Selma Interpretive Center with their elbows intertwined, holding their fists at chin level. A sign with a picture of a black male and a graduation cap and tassel reads, "In memory of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who gave his life in the struggle for the right to vote, February 26, 1965. Zion United Methodist Church. A small brown and white brick church with marquee with the words Zion United Methodist Church. Sunday school, 9:45. Morning worship, 11. And Bible study, 6. In bold letters, Wilma, England. A 2-story brick building with 2 large white columns with a sign with black and white stripes and the words Black Lives Matter. In front of a building surrounded by an 8-foot fence, a headstone with a black male with broad shoulders, square glasses, a mustache, and beard. 2 words, honoring Reverend James Orange, jailed as a leader in the struggle for voting rights, Perry County, Alabama, 1965. Under his picture in quotes, "Hey, leader!" Exclamation point. Presented by SCLC W period O period M period E period N Inc. Women's Organizational Movement for Equality Now. An outdoor exhibit reads Protest in Prison, with people lined up, coats walking toward and into an open gate leading into the prison. 3 uniformed police officers carrying batons watch as they enter the gates. At the bottom of a picture of James Orange stands outside the courthouse, wearing overalls with his hands tucked inside them. A white man with a suit, tie, and fedora stands in the entrance with one knee propped up and his hand on his thigh. A small 2-story brick building surrounded by an 8-foot fence with barbed wire and a gate and a sign, "No talking to inmates." In front of a campus of brick buildings, an engraved memorial with a black man with a covetous haircut reads, In memory, Albert Turner Sr., 1936 to 2000. Pioneer, freedom fighter, champion of voting rights, bold advocate for the poor and oppressed, presented by SCLC W period O period M period E period N period Inc. A brick building with stairways on both sides of the front with the words Albert Turner Sr., Courthouse, Annex, Albert Turner's Memorial sits off to the left.
Why is Bloody Sunday called Bloody Sunday? Jimmy Lee Jackson was an African American veteran and civil rights activist in Marion, Alabama, and a deacon in his Baptist church. On February 17, 1965, after a mass meeting which was normally held in the daytime, was held at night and attended by the Marion community. When the meeting was over, the attendees were going to march down to the Perry County Jail, which was about a half block away, and stand singing freedom songs to let James Orange know that he was not alone nor forgotten. Expecting Martin Luther King to attend the meeting, a vicious mob laid in waiting in the darkness of the woods for the meeting to end. C.T. Vivian attended in King's place and was later sneaked out of town in a coffin. The real plan was to murder Martin Luther King, but when the mob realized that Martin Luther King did not attend, they became even more angry. The people were rushed by a mob of Marion police officers, county sheriff's deputies, KKK, quote, law-abiding white citizens, and Alabama state troopers. During the standoff, streetlights were smashed, some sources say they were shot out by the police, and the police began to beat the protesters. Among those beaten were 2 white United Press International photographers whose cameras were smashed, and NBC News correspondent Richard Valinari, who was beaten so badly that he was hospitalized. The marchers turned and scattered back toward the church. They ran for safety, one of the places being Max's Cafe, which was around the corner from the church. It is not known if Jimmy Lee attended the meeting, but when he entered the cafe, the police officers were attacking his mother. When he tried to defend her, he was beaten by several police and dragged down to the darkest part of the street and shot. This was told to us by Della Maynor, who at this time was a 14-year-old foot soldier and was at the meeting and tried to escape. She was attacked and to this day has bursitis in her shoulder due to a blow from a billy club. She ran into Max's Cafe also. In the movie, the scene was portrayed to have taken place in Selma, but it did not. This happened in Marion, Alabama. Before his death, lying in a hospital, Jackson was served with an arrest warrant by Colonel Al Lingo, head of Alabama State Police. The Alabama State Senate responded to national criticism and, quote, formally denounced charges of dereliction by Lingo's troopers in Marion. Sister Michael Ann, an administrator at the hospital, later said there were powder burns on Jackson's abdomen, indicating that he was shot at very close range. He later died on February 26. Jackson was honored at his memorial service, eulogized as a martyr to a moral cause. He was buried in Herd Cemetery, an old slave burial ground next to his father. His headstone was paid for by the Perry County Civic League. In the decades since, his headstone has been vandalized, bearing the marks of at least one shotgun blast. As a result of Jackson's death and other violence, James Bevel, director of SCLC's Selma Voting Rights Movement, organized the first of the Selma to Montgomery marches due to Lucy Foster's ideal. Lucy Foster suggested that the people of Marion march with the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson and place his body at the feet of then-Governor George Wallace's feet. It was a way for citizens of Marion and Selma to direct their anger over Jackson's death and work for a positive outcome. It was also called to publicize the effort to gain voters' registration reform. Held a few days later on March 7, 1965, the march became known as Bloody Sunday because of the violent response of state troopers and the county sheriff's posse, who attacked and beat the protesters once again after they attempted to walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, leaving the city of Selma and entering the county. The reason protesters had to start at the Pettus Bridge in Selma is because the highway leading from Marion was too dark, long, 36 miles, and dangerous with too many woods for the same mob to hide in. There were no lights on CR 45 in 1965, and there are still no lights in 2021. CR 45 is known as the Albert Turner Senior Highway and also Jimmy Lee Jackson Highway. The first march was not successful in completing the march, but the events were widely covered and attracted international attention, raising widespread support for the voting rights campaign. The federal government committed itself to protect the marchers. In the third march to Montgomery, which began on March 21st, over 600 protesters were protected by federal troops and Alabama National Guard forces under federal command. They were told that only 300 people should participate in the march. They traveled the entire way, gathering more marchers along the route, and at the end of the march had a total of 25,000 people peacefully entering Montgomery, the largest civil rights event in the city ever. In 2005, former Alabama State Trooper James Bernard Fowler admitted that he had shot Jackson in what he said was self-defense soon after streetlights had gone out and a melee had broken out. Former Trooper Fowler was indicted in 2007 in Jackson's death. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. This is another FYI. Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot on February 17, 1965, and Malcolm X was shot on February 21, 1965. Jimmy later died on February 26, 1965.
Wilma and Tonya posed just outside the entrance of a 4-lane bridge made of steel and concrete. The bridge, shaped like a domed arch with multiple rows of open rectangles, measures 1,248 feet with the words Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Edmund Winston Pettus, the Grand Dragon. Wilma and Tonya wanted to see the bridge and was very proud to say that they walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge until they read who he was and what he stood for. He represented Alabama in the United States Senate. They now understand why John Lewis did not want the bridge named after him. After the renaming, some people, the KKK, would still call it the Edmund Pettus Bridge anyways. Edmund Winston Pettus, July 6, 1821 to July 27, 1907, was an American lawyer and politician who represented Alabama in the United States Senate from 1897 to 1907. He served as a senior officer of the Confederate States Army, commanding infantry in the Western Theater of the American Civil War. After the war, he was politically active in the Ku Klux Klan, serving as Grand Dragon. The Edmund Pettus Bridge across the Alabama River in Selma, built in 1940, was named in his honor. In 1965, the bridge became a landmark of the Civil Rights Movement.
A 4-foot white stone barricade with a gray granite sign, Civil Rights Memorial Center. Wilma sits in front of a black granite tribute sign with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Until justice rolls down like waters and the righteousness like a mighty stream. A black and gold sign with a circle crest encases the words Alabama at the top, followed by 2 stars on each side, an historical commission at the bottom, and a map at the center with Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida. Below, black members of the Alabama legislature who served during the Reconstruction period of 1868 to 1879.
The Civil Rights Museum. The Civil Rights Museum sits across the street from the Southern Poverty Law Center offices, commemorating those who died during the Civil Rights Movement. The memorial is surrounded by a curving black granite wall with the words, "Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream," scrolled across MLK. Below the wall is a black granite disc with water flowing over the surface, which is engraved by the names of those who lost their lives in the fight for the civil rights. The memorial is located in an open area next to the Civil Rights Memorial Center. Here, tourists will find a variety of exhibits and educational displays, as well as the Wall of Tolerance, which displays the names of visitors who have pledged to work towards tolerance and justice. Visitors may add their own names to the list, which is displayed digitally on the wall of the Memorial Center. Address: 400 Washington Avenue, Montgomery, Alabama. National Memorial for Justice and Peace. The National Memorial for Justice and Peace is the first memorial in the nation to be made in memory of the African Americans who were affected by slavery, lynchings, and racial injustice. This memorial, covering a total of 6 acres, includes sculptures, monuments, and an artwork which honor major figures in the civil rights movement. Perhaps the most impactful statement is the field of 800 monuments, each representing a county where lynchings occurred, and each engraved with the names of the known victims. These monuments are waiting to be claimed by their respective counties in hopes that acknowledgement of the dark past will lead to a brighter future.
A long cascading stone stairway leads to a large 3-story white building with 6 pillars and a black Roman numeral clock in a steeple and a rotunda. A statue of a man wearing a cape stands off in the distance. Wilma, Tonya, and an older black man, Cleon, stand in front of a brick home with a smoking barbecue pit. A white and green sign on the porch partially covered by brick pillars, Hometown School. In a grassy area shaped like a triangle in front of a brick building, a 6 to 7 foot white statue of a woman wearing a long headscarf and long flowing oversheath with her elbows at her side and hands outstretched by her chest. In front of a yard house, a wooden structure standing as tall as a tree with the top shaped like a triangle roof and a long singular piece of wood climbing up out of the structure, leaning past the power lines.
This ends our program for the evening. We hope that you traveled on this journey and had some breathtaking moments along with Wilma and Tonya. Tonya and Wilma have already made reservations to go back March 2nd, 2022. There were so many places that were closed due to the virus, and so many places they did not get a chance to visit. Wilma and Tonya plan to add their names to the Wall of Tolerance.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh, glory, glory.
Hands to the heavens, no man, no weapon formed against, yes, glory is destined. Everyday women and men become legends. Sins that go against our skin become blessings. The movement is a rhythm to us. Freedom is like religion to us. Justice is juxtaposition in us. Justice for all just ain't specific enough. One son died, the spirit is revisiting us. True and living in us. Resistance is us. That's why Rosa sat on the bus. That's why we walk through Ferguson with our hands up. When it go down, we woman and man up. They say stay down, and we stand up. Shots, we on the ground, the camera panned up. King pointed to the mountaintop, and we ran up.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh, glory, glory. Now the war is not over, victory isn't won, but we'll fight on to the finish, and then when it's all done, we'll cry glory, oh glory, oh.
Selma is now for every man, woman, and child. Even Jesus got his crown in front of a crowd. They march with the torch, we gon' run with it now. Never look back, we done gone hundreds of miles. From dark roads, heroes, to become a hero. Facing the League of Justice, his power was the people. Enemy is lethal, a king became regal. Saw the face of Jim Crow under a bald ego. No one can win a war individually. It take the wisdom of the elders and young people's energy. Welcome to the story we call victory. The coming of the Lord, my eyes have seen the glory.
One day, when the glory comes,